According to Pew Research, almost half of Americans pray daily,
on earth as it is in heaven.
and 2/3 pray at least a few times a month. For some, that might be hard to relate to. To outsiders, prayer can seem outdated, overly zealous, or even irrational.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
A ritual where people plead with an invisible God to grant their wishes. But if you talk to people who actually pray, the story is usually more complicated. They don't always expect answers, and often they're not even asking for anything. That's because the word prayer actually covers a wide range of practices. Sure, sometimes we ask for something, but other times we give thanks.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for food.
Or offer praise. Or recite formulaic phrases, even single words or sounds. Sometimes we pray alone.
Blessed is the fruit of thy womb.
Other times we gather with others. We may pray out loud or in silence.
Amen.
So what ties all these practices together? What makes them count as prayer? And what do they do for us? Why does prayer show up in nearly every spiritual tradition on earth, even among people who don't believe in a personal God? On today's episode, we'll talk with Dr. Andrew Newberg about the neuroscience of prayer.
When you do these practices, it's sort of like lifting weights for the brain. When you lift weights, what happens? Your muscle becomes bigger and it works better, it becomes stronger.
And with Rabbi Shira Stutman about how and why prayer isn't only about talking with God, but about changing ourselves too.
I am saying a prayer in which I'm acknowledging that God is a God of acts of loving kindness. And we say that as a reminder that we too should do acts of loving kindness.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
Part of what we've tried to do is think about kind of an overall set of structures that are at play. And then what a person is doing and how they're doing it, they engage this network in different ways.
Dr. Andrew Newberg is a neuroscientist at the forefront of neurotheology, a relatively new discipline that looks at the relationship between our brains and our spiritual lives. Over the years, Andrew has studied how the brain responds to all kinds of spiritual practices. But when it comes to prayer, he says the first thing to understand is that it's not just one thing.
There are many different kinds of prayer practices. Probably some of the basic categories that people are familiar with can be prayers that are just kind of recited prayers. You're saying the same thing over and over again. You know what it is, and you just say it. There's conversational prayer, where you're just talking to God and asking for support, asking, for strength to get through, but you're having a kind of conversation with God as opposed to actually just reciting something over and over again. It goes on, all the different specific elements of these prayers.
So let's explore that a little bit, just in terms of at least starting at the basic level, prayers that are said in kind of a rote way where you know the words versus spontaneous prayer versus kind of contemplative. What does your research show about what's going on in the brain?
So when a person is just reciting a prayer, we have done several studies of these kinds of prayers. They can be just sort of rote prayers. It could be considered a kind of mantra, so to speak, where you're just kind of focusing on something that you're repeating or saying over and over again. So these are often also considered to be concentrative practices, meaning that you are focusing your attention on them. You have to focus on, this is what I need to say. When you do that kind of a prayer, a number of different things happen. One of the things that we have observed is an increase of activity in their frontal lobe. So this is an area that's right behind your forehead. And this is an area that does turn on when we focus our attention on anything. So if you're driving your car and you get lost and you're trying to find your way, you use your frontal lobes to focus your mind on that. And so when people are doing a concentrative focusing practice, then we see increased activity as the person brings their attention to the object or prayer that they're doing.
But prayer isn't static. Like many things we do as humans, it's a complex and dynamic process. more like a video than a still image. In other words, what your brain is doing as you begin to pray can look very different even a few minutes later.
Now, as the process continues, part of what also can become activated in the brain depends a little bit on what the person experiences. If the person ultimately experiences an emotional reaction, they feel a sense of love or compassion, maybe they feel God's love or something like that, then the emotional areas of our brain are likely to become involved in that process. And then if it does ultimately coincide with, oh, well, these are the ways I should behave or believe, or it comes back to an ideology or something like that, well, this may activate some of the higher areas of our brain that hold our cognitive processes, our memories, our beliefs, and so forth. And it kind of reinforces those ideas and those beliefs as you do the practice. If you keep focusing on, God is one or something like that, then that idea becomes ingrained in the brain itself. There's a kind of cutesy statement that neurons that fire together wire together. So the more you use a particular conglomeration of neurons, the stronger those connections become, the stronger your beliefs become. And that's why prayers, at least from a neurological perspective, are so valuable and so effective, because they really help a person to have these ideas and concepts ingrained within them that become part of the fabric of who that person is.
But prayer isn't only about repetition and reinforcing beliefs. In some cases, particularly with practices like meditation and centering prayer, that initial surge in frontal lobe activity can lead somewhere else entirely.
What we see happening in many of these different practices is the person feels a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness. Maybe they feel like their self kind of goes away, so to speak. I mean, it's different terms that people use. But one of the things that we have hypothesized and found evidence for in our brain scans is that another area of our brain called the parietal lobe, which is located a little bit more towards the back part of the brain, is an area that normally takes our sensory information and helps us to kind of create a spatial representation of ourself and the world around us. So what we had always hypothesized is that if that area turns on to kind of give us our sense of self, then as it quiets down, we lose that sense of self and we lose the boundary between ourself and other. And so we will feel intimately connected with another person, the universe, God, whatever it is that the person feels. And again, this is exactly what we have seen when we did brain scans of Franciscan nuns doing centering prayer. We saw increases of activity in their frontal lobe, but we see decreases of activity in this parietal lobe, this orienting part of the brain that seems to be associated with this very powerful feeling of oneness and connectedness. And we've seen this in other kinds of practices when there is that same kind of feeling of oneness and connectedness.
That feeling of connection is common across many types of solitary prayer. But in many traditions, it's just as often a collective experience.
Sing to the earth, bless the name of the Lord, proclaim God's salvation from day to day.
Of course, it's not easy to run brain scans on large groups of people mid-prayer, so the science is still developing. But Andrew says we already know enough about how the brain works to make some educated guesses about what's going on when people pray together.
When you are engaged in a larger ritual where there's prayer and many people engaged in that process, on one hand, I think you're going to see certain similarities. You're going to feel emotions. You're going to maybe be concentrating on the prayer itself. But what also is interesting is this decrease of activity in the parietal lobe, which now makes you feel connected to the group. So you're all swaying together. Now I'm connected to the person next to me, who's connected to the person next to that person, and so on. And so that's part of the value of rituals. In fact, I mean, when we talk about what rituals ultimately do for us as human beings, one of the critical features is to break down that self-other dichotomy and bring people together. But what's also kind of interesting is it's not just the ritual part, but the elements of the story, so to speak, whatever the practice is or the teachings, the ideology that you're now connecting with as well. So you can have a large group of people who it's basically we're right and everyone else is wrong. And so you have this kind of cohesiveness within the group, but then you have a sense of animosity, fear, hatred, and so forth outside. And that's why rituals can be great at bringing people together, but unfortunately also great at leading to enormous conflict as well.
But of course, if the story changes, so do group prayer's potential effects.
You could be a very small group of 5 people, and if your ideology is you're connected to all of humanity, then that sense of oneness is to all of humanity, and you feel at one with everyone, and you're going to be compassionate and loving to everyone.
Whether we're praying alone or in a group, the effects can run deep. Of course, just sitting down and saying a prayer doesn't guarantee you'll feel anything, let alone a deep spiritual connection. So what makes the difference between a meaningful experience and one that leaves us cold? According to Andrew, one of the biggest factors is how well the practice aligns with who we are. For example,
Hail Mary, full of grace.
several studies have shown that people who prayed the rosary experienced a measurable drop in anxiety. But hand that same practice to someone unfamiliar with Catholic tradition, and you're unlikely to see the same effect. The brain's response depends, in part, on how deeply you're engaged. But when a practice does resonate with someone, that can lead to profound and lasting changes in the brain. One of Andrew's studies looked at people viewing religious symbols while undergoing brain scans. The results were striking. People's emotional relationship to the symbol, positive or negative, affected not just the higher-level processes in the brain, but also activity in the primary visual cortex, the region that receives and processes raw visual data before we're even consciously aware of it. In other words, our spiritual beliefs may literally change the way we perceive the world. That's partly because emotion plays such a central role in how our brains store information. Emotions influence the hippocampus, a part of the brain involved in encoding memory. Now you may ask, why would a memory center be influenced by emotions? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, the connection makes perfect sense. Remembering emotionally intense experiences, especially negative ones, can help keep us alive. If you get mugged in a dark alley, maybe you avoid dark alleys in the future. But the same logic applies to strong positive emotions too. So when praying triggers an intensely positive spiritual experience, it's much likelier to become part of the mental architecture we carry forward. So what kind of effect does that have on how we live? Is there any evidence that prayer can be good for us?
Most studies of prayer and certainly meditation practices show that these practices tend to have a pretty positive effect on people. It tends to reduce their anxiety. It tends to reduce their depressive feelings. They handle stressors better. Now, again, there's some caveats to that. Obviously, if they're preying on negative stuff, on hatred and anger and so forth, then no, it's not going to. But most prayers are about love, compassion, support, and so forth. And so we see that. We've done a couple of really interesting studies, or I think are interesting studies, of the long-term effects of these practices on the brain. And one of the things that we showed was actually a study where we sent people to a spiritual retreat program that they went to for a week. It was a Christian-based practice, so it was based on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And we scanned their brain to look at the dopamine and serotonin areas of the brain before and after the retreat. And what we found was that after they'd gone through this very immersive, very intense meditative process, which they'd found to be incredibly powerful and a lot of self-reflection, prayer, meditation, and so forth, what we found was that their brain was more sensitive to the effects of dopamine and serotonin, two very important neurotransmitters. So you do this kind of practice, if it helps to predispose your brain or sensitize your brain to the effects of dopamine, you're more likely to have positive feelings. Similarly, it did the same thing. It sensitized the brain to serotonin, which is exactly what we use for medicines that are antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. So we start to see this physiological effect in the brain as a result of doing this practice over some period of time. And of course, that was after 1 week. So imagine what's going on if you're, a nun or a monk and you're doing these practices for hours a day for a lifetime, how it's going to change you.
That's a fascinating finding because there is this data that shows engagement in private prayer practices, especially among younger adults, where we're seeing a lot of increased anxiety and depression right now, is a buffer for those. And I think you're pointing to exactly how it can do that physiologically.
Right. When you do these practices, the analogy I like to use is it's sort of like lifting weights for the brain. When you lift weights, what happens? Your muscle becomes bigger and it works better. It becomes stronger. Well, studies of long-term meditators compared to non-meditators have shown that their frontal lobes are bigger in long-term meditators than non-meditators. So much like a muscle, it's like the brain itself actually got bigger. And in our study, which was a longitudinal study, another one that did this meditation practice for about a 2-month period, it showed that their frontal lobes were more active. And again, this is not while you're meditating. This is just at rest. So the frontal lobes are involved in concentration and attention. So your concentration skills and your attention skills are better. That means you're going to remember things better. And interestingly, the frontal lobe is connected to the limbic system to help us regulate our emotional responses. So when your frontal lobe is more active, you can self-regulate your responses. You become less anxious, you become less depressed. So there's a lot of very important effects that are going on. And again, I mean, like the meditation study we did was 12 minutes a day for 2 months. It's not like you have to sit on a mountainside for 6 hours a day for 30 years.
When Andrew talks about prayer being like lifting weights, it's a comparison that works on many levels. Because spiritual practices like prayer don't just affect parts of our brain. They help shape our whole being.
Rituals really are the kind of the physical embodiment of the practices that are involved in religion and spirituality. They help us to come back to our ideals and concepts over and over again, which makes us remember them. They become important to us. And then because the rituals engage our brain and our body, it's not just that we have an idea about something, but we feel it deeply within us. So it becomes a fundamental part of who we are. It's our entire person that engages those religious and spiritual beliefs. And I think that's why it is such a universal process for people.
Understanding how prayer and contemplation affect our minds and bodies can offer important insights. But one thing it can't tell us is what prayer actually feels like to someone who's praying, or why they choose to pray in the way they do. So we invited friend of the show, Rabbi Shira Stutman, to talk it over. In addition to being the senior rabbi at the Aspen Jewish congregation, Shira co-hosts the Chutzpah podcast, and is most recently author of the acclaimed book, The Jewish Way to a Good Life. In all those roles, she often talks about the power of prayer, which, for Jews, usually happens in group settings.
Praying in community is like going to a concert with your favorite artist and singing their most popular song with the entire group of people that are there. And at concert, you actually might not know anyone else, maybe the person sitting next to you. And so in a prayer service, you actually are likely to know more of the people. But praying in community can give you not only your energy, but the energy of however many dozens or hundreds of people are around you.
In religious studies, there's a popular framework for thinking about the different dimensions of faith: believing, behaving, and belonging. For many Jews, belonging comes first. That's why there are plenty of Jews out there who don't believe in God or who don't keep kosher, but still consider themselves Jewish. And according to Shira, it's also what makes communal prayer so central to Jewish life.
Really, at our core, we are a belonging group. So if we apply that sort of core teaching to prayerfulness, then it would make sense that Jewish prayer is done in community. It's called in Hebrew a minyan, or a group of 10 people who need to be together in order to say certain of our prayers. And specifically some of the prayers in which one could argue you will need other humans around you when you're saying the prayer, because you're going to want people to lean into. So the most obvious example is the Mourner's Kaddish, the Mourner's Prayer. The Mourner's Kaddish is a prayer that you are technically only allowed to say with a minimum of 9 other people, because the understanding is you're going to need those people as you walk the path of mourning. Another obvious example for us Jews is the call to prayer. We, like Muslims, have a call to prayer. Because it is a call, it is not something that you're allowed to do on your own. You can only do it in a group of people.
One thing we know when people are in community singing or praying is their breathing synchronizes, their heart rate synchronizes. They feel part of a greater whole, which in some ways I think makes you feel inherently safe. It can open up your mind more to those messages of connection that are coming. And that makes me think about the role of embodiment in practices. So in some prayer traditions, pretty much people will sit or just kneel and fold their hands and pray. In Islamic traditions, there's a lot of movement of the body up and down and kneeling. And I know in Judaism, right, there are ritualized things you're supposed to do too. What role does the body play in prayer?
I think a lot of people don't think of Jews as embodied. They think of us as cerebral, the people of the book, the people of learning. And certainly there is a lot of that in the Jewish tradition. But there is a tremendous choreography to Jewish prayer. I mean, it's nothing as beautiful as a Muslim prayer service, which really is like almost entirely a sort of dance. But in a Jewish prayer service, people will be standing and they'll be sitting and they'll be bowing as a physical representation of what we're trying to say to God in that moment. There is a prayer called the Kedusha, where we are supposed to get up on our tippy toes to be like the angels, so that we are really supposed to try to feel with our bodies what we're attempting to do with our spirits and souls. But there is so much. I mean, the Sukkot holiday, which is a harvest holiday, we literally walk around the sanctuary of the synagogue multiple times, carrying branches and a citron and shaking them all around to all the different directions of the universe as a way of praying for rain, gratitude for harvest, like everything all at once. So there is a tremendous amount of embodied practice in Judaism. It's just, I think even a lot of Jews don't really know where to find it.
Have you ever done some of those prayers with and without the embodiment? I'm just wondering what you feel when it's there, when it's missing.
So for me, I definitely think the choreography adds to it. But you might hear me hesitating as I'm answering you. And the hesitation comes from the fact that I understand the Hebrew. I know the prayers almost entirely by heart, if not entirely by heart, and therefore I can read them quite quickly. I've also been doing a lot of these embodied practices for, most of my 51 years. And so it elevates me because I am able to concentrate on these practices. Like when I go up on my toes, when I do the Kedusha prayer, I know what I'm supposed to be feeling. And so I really try to go there. I mean, I'm a rabbi, And so the challenge for a lot of Jews is that there is just so much to know. And then secondarily, a lot of Jews feel a sort of embarrassment that they feel like they should know more, which of course they shouldn't. We all know what we know, and that's totally fine. And so they can trip up and start to feel that it's more important to get the bow in the exact right place than to actually communicate with the universe.
It's interesting. One thing that this brings up to me, there's always this tension in prayer between knowing what to say and knowing what to do in a way that it can almost become rote after a while, or fearful, as you're saying, am I doing it right? Versus saying, what the hell? And being moved by the Spirit. I think in Judaism, this is not exactly, but it's a rough approximation to the idea between the keva, which is the ritualized aspects of the prayer, and then the kavanah, which is the feeling part of it. And so how do you balance those two, and what's the role of each of those in successful prayer?
Okay, so as you know, Jews are commanded to pray 3 times a day, right? In the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. And for those people who take that commandment seriously, the keva can become onerous, right? The responsibility, the formality of it all, the making sure you do the morning prayer in the morning and the afternoon prayer in the afternoon can actually overtake any feeling of kavanah, any feeling of intentionality. And so one of the things that rabbis work really hard to do is to pull people out of the keva and into the kavanah. But it's really complicated because there are certain prayers that we are commanded to say in Judaism. We say the Shema prayer, in which we recognize that all is oneness and our job is just to listen to the universe. We say it 3 times a day. So how can you 3 times a day really settle into this idea of oneness? Okay, well, so you can't. But the hope is that if you say the Shema 3 times a day, 21 times a week, then maybe 3 or 4 of those times, your keva, your fixed prayer, will have kavanah, will have intentionality.
Repetition is one of the most common strategies to help people absorb the meaning and significance of fixed prayers like the Shema. Part of the reason may be physiological. Studies show that repeating prayers can help regulate breathing and slow heart rate, which may put practitioners in a more receptive state. Researchers have seen this effect in Christians praying the rosary, and it may help explain why prayer beads are used in so many faith traditions around the world. From Islam and Hinduism to Buddhism, Sikhism, and the Baha'i faith. And as it turns out, the rhythm of prayer matters too. As part of his research, Andrew Newberg found that the speed at which a prayer is recited can have a significant impact on how it's experienced. He had a chance to demonstrate this during a talk he was giving at a synagogue.
One of the things that we talked about a lot in there was that when you slow language down, it becomes more meaningful and people can kind of engage it better. So I said, well, let's do this. Let's take the most important prayer in Judaism, the Shema, which basically just says God is one. And instead of just saying it, let's have one breath for each word. And so we did that. And the people, afterwards came out and said, that was so incredible. I really focused on it and it meant so much to me that, I never really thought about it that way before.
But sometimes finding a deeper connection in prayer isn't just about how you say it. It's about how you prepare yourself to say it. Getting into the right headspace can make all the difference.
In the Talmud, even 2,000 years ago, the rabbis said that you are supposed to meditate for an hour a day before you say your prayers. Now, in those days, their prayers were much shorter than the Jewish prayer service of this morning. But even a few thousand years ago, the rabbis understood that in order to have kavanah, in order to have intention, you had to be calm, right? You had to be centered. And so meditation was of critical importance in the Jewish prayer service. What started to happen over time was Jewish prayer services got longer and longer and longer. And so the meditation piece of them got edged out until the sort of arrival on the scene of the Hasidic tradition a few hundred years ago, in which meditation became once again part of the spiritual practice. Because the pendulum of Judaism had moved too far toward keva, toward saying specific prayers at specific times. And the Hasidic rabbis tried to bring it a little bit back toward kavanah, toward intentionality.
Okay, so we've centered our minds and prepared our bodies. We've repeated our prayers enough times to know them well. Maybe we've even experimented with saying them in different ways, just to see how it changes the experience. But what about the words themselves?
A lot of what I do as a rabbi is trying really hard to get people to say the words that Jews have been saying for thousands of years, but to try to understand them differently. And look, one of the benefits we have, and I would assume this is true for people of all faith traditions, is that we say these prayers every day or every week or every year, and the prayers are the same, but we're not. And so a prayer for peace that we might have been saying sort of more in a more rote way 2 years ago, when a lot of Jews are praying desperately for peace in Israel and Palestine, will just read really, really different. And so the words are exactly the same, but our approach to the words is quite different.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu.
Exploring the meaning behind the words is, of course, one of the oldest and most powerful ways people across faith traditions connect with prayer. In Judaism, prayer happens in Hebrew, a deeply symbolic language that allows for many layers of meaning and interpretation. And just like Arabic is the language of prayer in Islam, and Latin used to be the language of Catholicism, Hebrew as a shared language allows Jews anywhere in the world to enter a synagogue and feel like they belong. So for some, diving deep into the meaning behind the words can bring clarity, focus, and a stronger sense of connection. But of course, that kind of close attention can also have its downsides. Focusing too much on understanding every word or getting it exactly right can pull you out of the moment, or even make you question what you're saying in the first place. Which is why some Jews move away from words altogether.
So I remember a time when I was in Israel and I went to prayer services, but I wouldn't even call them prayer services because they were almost entirely just nigunim, just like nai nai nai, yai dai dai, and not a lot of the actual words you're supposed to say. And I went up to the prayer leader afterwards and I said, this was so interesting. Talk to me about your choice of doing mostly nigunim wordless melodies rather than saying the words Jews have used for however long. And the guy said to me, he's like, yeah, the difference between you and me is that we Israelis actually understand what this Hebrew is saying. And because we understand it, sometimes it actually feels less relevant and more archaic. And so we actually sometimes prefer to have services in which we're doing all the nai-nai-naiing and the yai-di-dying. We actually get to a certain spiritual place because we're not worried about the fact like, oh, wow, I just said God created the earth, but I don't really believe that God created the earth, so maybe I shouldn't say that. And we can just like plug into the spiritual current that's already all around us rather than worrying about the words on the page. And I will never forget that moment, right? Because of course they understand these words in a way that most Americans do not. And so sometimes that means they want to be more connected to the prayers and because they understand what they're saying, but sometimes it can stop you from getting where you need to go.
Letting go of the words is one way to stay connected to intention. But Shira says that even if you're going to keep using words to pray, maybe it's enough to just let go of the need to get them exactly right.
Let me tell you a story about my friend Stuart Miller. We went to college together, and he called me, so this was at this point probably about 25 years ago, and he says, listen, Shira, I need to confess something to you. I was like, I mean, Jews don't do confession, but fine. I said, okay, confess to me. He said, I just took my bar exam yesterday. I just finished it yesterday. And I said, great, congratulations. And he said, I wanted to say a prayer before I started the exam. So I said, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, hamotzi lecha min haaretz. Do you know what prayer that is? You don't know, Dave. This is the prayer that we say before we eat bread, right? So the prayer that he said had nothing to do with the bar exam in front of him. It was just the prayer that he remembered in that moment. And I said, Stuart, that was the perfect prayer, right? First of all, there is no traditional prayer for right before you take the bar exam, but it doesn't matter. What mattered in that moment was he had the kavanah that he was making a request of God, right? And so he just needed to say whatever words he knew. And, you know, I believe God heard that prayer. In Judaism, we have something called the blessing formula. So the first three words of every blessing are Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, God. And one thing I say to people all the time when they're getting more interested in religion and in Judaism is don't spend all of your time trying to learn every single prayer. I mean, that can be Judaism 301 or 401, whatever it is. But right now, every time you're grateful for something, say, Baruch atah Adonai, I am so grateful to be back on this podcast, right? Baruch atah Adonai. I am so grateful that my child is home from college for a few days. And I just believe in a God who can hear that. And I believe that you can hear that. And that's gratitude at its core.
What does it do for people, though? Why do you think he felt the need for prayer then? And why do you think it was important to follow up on that need?
I think there are a few reasons. First of all, I think when we pray, and I would include in prayer in this moment, meditate, it can calm and regulate our system, right? That's part of what you were talking about earlier, where people who are praying together breathe together. And so when we say a prayer, it just can calm us. So I imagine when Stuart had the bar exam in front of him and he said this prayer, there was a way that he felt it was the Jewish equivalent of taking a deep breath in a certain sort of way. I also think that many human beings walk through the world with a feeling of existential loneliness, right? Whether it's because we don't really know why we're here, or at the end of the day, sometimes we just feel alone. To know that there is a God who, depending on your theology, has your back, or will walk next to you no matter what happens with the bar exam, or has created the world for a certain reason, even if you don't understand it, right? Pick your theology, can actually help make you feel less alone. You are part of humankind and you're part of the universe. You're part of this fabric. You are not just a unitary creature. And I think those are certainly some of the reasons that I pray.
Have you noticed anything about how starting a practice of prayer changes people?
I mean, first of all, it connects them to God or God's presence or the potential in the universe, like whatever euphemism you want to use. But to me, that's just the starting point. I think that having a prayer practice can actually change the prayer as well, right? Because in Judaism, at least, we understand prayer as not necessarily even changing God above, although that might be the case, but definitely changing us. I am saying a prayer in which I'm acknowledging that God is a God of chesed, of acts of loving kindness. And we say that not just as a way of like making God feel good about God's self. God feels just fine about God's self. We say that as a reminder that we too should do acts of chesed or of loving kindness. Because our Talmud says that just as God buries the dead, so too should we bury the dead. Just as God feeds the hungry, so too should we feed the hungry. And so a prayer practice itself actually can be, if we let it, transformative in terms of the way that we approach every single day that we are alive. And that's before we even get to the community benefits, right? Because if you're doing Jewish prayer and therefore you're buying into the conceit that you need to do it with other people, then you're showing up with the same people every day or every week, and you are building community, and you're also helping people through their own difficult moments, their own mourning, their own life cycle events. And so it can be transformative in that way too.
Oftentimes, one of the things people pray for is to make the world a better place, whether it's for peace or reducing suffering or increasing justice. I know that in many traditions, for example, in Buddhism, there's a strong argument that meditation is a way to foster one's empathy and kindness and compassion, and there's evidence to back that up. I'm wondering, in Jewish prayer, is there a goal, or have you seen it motivate people to try and repair the world?
Yeah, 100%. The Talmud teaches a synagogue is required to have windows. Why? So that when you pray, it's not just sort of like some internal thing that we are doing as an end to itself. It's so that we can see the outside world. And so if prayer is an end unto itself in Judaism, it is definitely not enough. Prayer also must be a means to an end. And the end is actually healing the world, is being kinder, is being more generous, is bringing Judaism from the synagogue and the home onto the streets.
We may not know whether a divine entity is actually listening when we pray. But what we do know from both science and lived experience is that our minds and bodies are. And what they hear depends on how we pray. Rote prayer can calm us. Centering prayer can open our minds. And communal prayer can bind us together. And while the stories our prayers tell can help shape how we think, sometimes the intention we put into the act, whatever form it takes, can matter just as much. Maybe that's a reason why most religions have multiple forms of prayer, and why many people, almost instinctually, feel called to it, even when they're not entirely sure of what they believe. I think New York Times journalist Lauren Jackson might have captured it best at the start of her multi-article series on belief, when she said, "I left my faith, but I still pray. I just don't know what or whom I'm praying to." Prayer focuses us, changes us, and in that sense, it might actually help us find some of the answers we're looking for, whatever our theological stance might be. Next time on How God Works, another form of prayer, but one long surrounded by mystique and skepticism.
And so they're like, people who speak in tongues are basically psychological misfits. They're pretending. It's all just fake.
Speaking in tongues, often perceived as a fringe religious practice, is part of one of the fastest growing Christian movements in the world.
They'd grown from, a couple thousand to 500 million in 100 years. That's like an incredible organizing project. So I was like, why is this inspiring to you? How do you mobilize yourselves? How do you build the community that makes this so strong?
And the science behind how this ecstatic, spontaneous act can actually encourage a deep feeling of calm and connection if you just let go.
I feel like I'm switching to a different part of my brain, trying intentionally to let go. to plug in, to empower. At the end of me speaking in tongues, I'll feel more at peace with clarity of how I need to pray.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and that's next time on How God Works. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at HowGodWorksPod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.